And welcome, everybody. We have Dr. Nicholas DiDonato, an Eastern Orthodox metaphysician, who is going to present a talk on the mystery of, the myth, I should say, of unity. Mystery would have been an interesting title, too. But no, the myth of unity, kind of playing off David Bentley Hart, but I'll let him address that a little bit further here in a moment. But welcome back, Dr. DiDonato. It's great to have you back on. How are you?
It is a pleasure to be back. I'm doing well.
It's a pleasure to have you, and I'm really looking forward to hearing this and learning your thoughts and perspective on how we can work towards reunion. So I'm really excited. So just go ahead and tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you do, and then just take it away. And what I'll do is I'll just get out of the way, but I'll be here listening.
Sure. My name is Nick DiDonato. I specialize, as Michael said, in metaphysics, specifically from a theological perspective. So I'm especially interested in areas of interlap between theology and science, especially philosophy of science. So my personal work is looking at the metaphysics and the theology of the patristics, especially Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, and looking at that tradition. Usually goes back to also Gregory of Nyssa and forward to people like Maximus the Confessor and John of Damascus, and also Gregory Palamas. And then looking at that metaphysical understanding of reality and then contrasting that with effectively modern science, but looking at modern science from a metaphysical perspective. So tonight I'm doing something entirely different and in no way related to my Arab expertise, but I hope that's okay. And I still hope that the arguments I make that you will find persuasive. So the title of the paper is The Myth of Unity. And well, I will just get right to the talk then. Approximately 2.5% of the population is dead. The highest loss of life in American history. Trust me, I'm not talking about COVID. I'm not trying to broach politics here. I'm talking about the American Civil War. Leading up to the war, people on both sides, North and South, for those who don't know, the North was anti-slavery, the South was pro-slavery, and while the war had many causes, long story short, it was mainly about slavery. And then leading up to the war, people said, why don't we go back in the past? Why don't we go back when we were all united, North and South, and were able to agree on slavery? And as they discussed this and debated this in the Senate, in the House, they realized, I don't think there actually was such agreement. Instead, in the Constitution and various compromises, such as the Missouri Compromise, people found diplomacy, expedient solutions, and various other ways to sort of go over the issue and sort of agree, disagree, and then just move forward. Obviously, in American history, this turned out to be completely untenable. But the point was, there was this idea, especially in the 1850s, that only we could go back in time. We could recover this unity that we had as North and South. And so I'm going to argue that when it comes to Catholics and Orthodox over the role of the papacy, it's similar to the American Civil War. That we go back to the first millennium and say, wow, if only we could go back to the first millennium where everyone kind of agreed on the Pope and everyone was in harmony. I'm going to argue, actually, that's a myth. There is a myth of unity that really, especially on the Orthodox side, there had not been consistent agreement on the role of the papacy. There simply had not been that. And we're going to see how, through three test cases, various complexities that emerged when the Pope and the Orthodox churches interacted. So what I'm going to do in this particular argument is go through 4 steps. First, I'm going to give key definitions. So you know what I mean, especially by words like papal supremacy, and I'm referring to emperor versus Holy Roman Emperor, what I mean by these kinds of terms. And then second, I'm going to argue why the first millennium, while it's necessary, I'm not in any way saying we should just ignore history, it's necessary, but not a sufficient condition for moving forward in terms of restoring the relationship between the East, the Orthodox bishops, and the papacy. The first reason being because there's no more emperor, and the emperor was critical to unity in the first millennium. Third, I will give a second reason for this argument. Again, the argument being that the first millennium is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the future of Orthodox relations with the papacy, because as I already alluded to by Civil War analogy, there never really was a standard, universally accepted, and consistently laid out orthodox reception of the papacy. So there's variation both in terms of whether to accept certain papal claims, and there's also variation even when the Orthodox do accept papal claims, why they're accepting the papal claims. So there's variation on both counts. Fourth and finally, I'm going to look to, as I think is appropriate, Pope John Paul II to look for a ways forward, what we can do in our current situation, where we have not had unity, and we still don't have unity, and now things are just seemingly getting worse. So first, as promised, definitions are in order. By emperor, I will always refer to the Eastern Roman Emperor, the one who's enthroned in Constantinople. So to avoid confusion, if I say Western Emperor, that refers to the emperor in the West when the West was part of the Roman Empire. Obviously, that phases out over time, so there's going to be a time where there is a Western Emperor and time when there's not a Western Emperor. Now, when there is a new, we could say, Western Emperor with the Frankish kings, I'm going to call that the Holy Roman Emperor. So again, Western Emperor means the emperor is part of the Roman Empire. Holy Roman Emperor means he is not. And I admit that using the Holy Roman Emperor this way is anachronistic. I understand that, but I'm just trying to keep the terms simple. By papal supremacy, I'm going to mean powers unique to the Pope of Rome that allow him to do one of two things. First, to have universal jurisdiction over the church, such that he can appoint, depose, and must approve of bishops anywhere in the world. And secondly, that he can overrule, change, and immune to discipline by councils, at least during his lifetime. Lastly, by the myth of unity, I actually do not mean to contradict or refute anything in David Bentley Hart's article, The Myth of Schism, which I recommend everyone read. It's a fantastic article. And in fact, I grant the key arguments of that paper. So I agree that theological and doctrinal disputes between Catholics and Orthodox reduce to issues of papal supremacy. I agree that the Pope can speak infallibly when expressing the teachings of the universal church. And I agree that the division between Orthodox and Catholics only goes back to the 18th century. I agree with all those points. But you may notice that none of those points contradict my thesis, which is that the first millennium cannot be a sufficient guide for restoring Catholic Orthodox relations today. So second now, getting into the actual arguments. First argument is that the first millennium cannot be a sufficient guide for today because the key to unity was the emperor, and quite obviously, there is no emperor. So to understand this, we have to remember that the emperor actually regarded himself as such. There was an understanding of there being one God, one church, one empire, or one nation. This is a very common understanding in the Christian East. So the emperor saw it as his duty to preserve the unity and holiness of the church because he thought that was his mission given to him by God. That's what he's there to do, to keep the country and the church together. This is called symphonia. This theory is political understanding, or I'll just call it symphony to keep things simple. So symphony, the idea is that this church and the state, they are distinct entities. This is not theocracy. They're distinct entities, but they work together in symphony to bring people to Christ, to bring people to communion with God. So it's not trying to bring about a utopia on earth. If I'm trying to basically bring people to like a monastic life or a proper married life, these kinds of things are purely, not purely, a sacramental life. That's the idea, to have communion with God. And the emperor has a role in that. Obviously, the bishops do too. But again, the idea is that the state's going to pass laws and the emperor is going to follow the divine patterns. The emperor is going to be a model of virtue. He's going to lead the people towards God. He's going to do things like Constantine did, like shut down the excesses of pagan temples, for example, temple prostitution. These kinds of things, the emperor is going to intervene and say, no, this is leading people astray. This is demonic. It doesn't deal with forced conversion, though that did happen, obviously, but that's not what Symphonia is about. It's about the emperor taking on the responsibility to lead his people to God. And as part of that, there was expectation that God would reward him. This is based on the covenant with David, that when the ruler leads the people rightly, they are rewarded. So here's a quote from Eusebius on this matter. And gladly does he, being God, accept and welcome this sacrifice, the sacrifice the emperor gives, which is not like a literal sacrifice of animals, obviously. He's a Christian, but the sacrifice being of his nation. He offers his nation to God. And commend the presenter of so august and noble an offering, that's the emperor, by protracting his reign to a lengthened period of years, giving larger proofs of his beneficence in proportion to the emperor's holy services of himself to himself. Accordingly, he permits him to celebrate each successive festival during great and general prosperity throughout the empire, advancing one of his sons at the recurrence of each decennial period to share its own imperial power. End quote. In other words, as the emperor does his due diligence and makes the proper offerings to God, offers nations to God, God is going to reward him with a lengthened period of years, rewarding his son, renewing the empire. This is the idea. This is Symphonia. Now, there's a lot more that can be said about that, but this is not a lecture about Symphonia. The point where this matters for the relationship between the papacy and the Orthodox churches is the emperor is the one who calls forth the ecumenical councils. One of the keys to unity in the first millennium would have been, I think, undoubtedly the ecumenical councils. Well, this has to go to the question then, what exactly is an ecumenical council? And then why is the emperor so important for that? So the ecumenical council comes from the Greek word ekumene. Ekumene is basically the world or the part of the world that's indwelt. You can think of the Greek words like ekos or ikeo, right? These are all words that mean like a household or a dwelling or to dwell, right, as a verb. So that's the idea, the part of the world that's dwelt. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, well, lots of the world is inhabited. Yes, that's true. But the way this word is made is specifically in the Roman Empire. Obviously, this is kind of, we could say, a selfish way of looking at the civilized or inhabited world. So we're talking about the ekumene, right? It's about the part of the world that's specifically the Roman Empire. This is seen to be the civilized, inhabited part of the world, outside of which is just barbarism. That's at least how the word is used and understood. Obviously, that's not very politically correct, but that's not really the point. The point is that the ecumenical council is accounts of the ekumene, of the inhabited civilized world. That's what it is. That's called forth then by definition by the emperor, because he's the one in charge of, again, remember, it's the idea of one nation. It's very hard, I think, for us to understand this mentality. It's one nation, one God, one church, understanding, especially when we live in a post-Reformation world, and diversity is praised. This understanding of, no, there's one proper civilization, the Roman Empire, one proper church, and I'm the one proper emperor, and I have to keep all this in order. And again, when I do that, is to call forth ecumenical councils. So that's what ecumenical council is. It's a council called forth by the emperor for the empire. So because of that, the emperor at times had to drag bishops to these councils. Sometimes the bishops didn't go willingly. And we can see this today when, Orthodox people try to call forth councils. Some simply don't show up. Well, that really was a problem in the first millennium because the emperor would make you show up. Also, there's disputes nowadays about agendas. Again, not a problem because the emperor would set the agenda. And in fact, it's very important because then, as now, if the emperor doesn't exert enough pressure, sometimes the councils go off the rails. So this is actually very important that the emperor do just the right amount of pressure, set the agenda, direct the bishops what you're supposed to be doing, but not just tell them what to do, because that would be obviously inappropriate. But there has to be a balance here. He has to really have tight enough balance such that they get something done. Too loose, you have chaos, like we often experience with councils trying to be called today. There's chaos. No one can agree on anything. But obviously, too tight a bounds, and everyone's willing to acknowledge this was a robber council. This was corrupt. The emperor rigged everything. This is not legitimate. So the emperor has to find this sweet spot. And then once the councils are called, it's up to the emperor to enforce the decisions of the councils. That's part of his job, and he has the military might to do it. That's part of his job. So ideally he'd set the agenda, but then let the bishops decide, and then basically make sure that what they say actually happens in the empire. I mean, this is all ideal. I'm not saying it's always played out perfectly, but I'm saying this is how the emperor saw himself and why he's important to unity, because he's the reason why these ecumenicals happen, why they don't go off the rails, why their decrees actually have any kind of force, is because of the emperor. And lastly, I'll add that the emperor often was a source of appeals when there's dispute during a council. So perhaps the most famous incidence of this is that in the Council of Chalcedon, there was a dispute over the definition. Some of the legates did not like the definition that was initially proposed, and the appeal goes to the emperor. And the emperor says, basically, you have to rework it. So this is the idea. The emperor is utterly key to the unity because of ecumenical councils, keeping the church together, keeping the church united, and basically making people talk to each other and get on the same page. So the emperor had the desire for Christian unity and the authority to do so. And that's just something currently lacking. No one has the authority, and even if someone had the desire, they simply wouldn't be able to make this happen anymore. Now, I'm sure people have several complaints about this. One is that, well, didn't Ephesus and Chalcedon fail? Because obviously there were significant schisms in both of those. Yes, that's absolutely true. Obviously, they're now non-Chalcedonian churches, right? The Assyrian church rejected Ephesus. That's perfectly granted. The point is simply, though, when it comes to the Pope and the Orthodox bishops, these were all successful. So even though we could say the emperor was not successful in maintaining the unity of the church, absolutely, but without any exception, obviously that's not true. He was successful in at least being able to keep the Pope in communion with the Orthodox bishops and vice versa, and keeping the Orthodox bishops in communion with the Pope. So the emperor was effective in doing that in the first millennium. Someone else may say, well, there's no emperor. Is emperor necessary for unity? Am I saying that as emperor, all hope was lost? Well, of course not, because Jesus didn't give us an emperor, right? The emperor was a later development. Now, I would argue this is a positive development, and the ecumenical councils were good things and very important things. But clearly, in the providence of God, the emperor is not meant to be a permanent institution. There was not an emperor in the first 3 centuries, obviously, and there's an emperor now. So the emperor is not necessary, but I think it's difficult to argue against the fact that he helped. And last thing I think people might argue is like, wait a second, didn't several emperors recognize papal authority? Right? You read some of the things Justinian especially says in his codex. He has very strong papal claims. And this is going to probably get the next point a little bit too, but in terms of the imperial perspective, sometimes yes, but a lot of times no. I mean, just going back to the Justinian case, yes, he says lots of great things about the papacy, but then the way he actually treats Pope Vigilius is a whole different story. So you find this consistently. My favorite example of this is Emperor Constans II. He thinks that Pope Martin I is illegitimate because he didn't get to approve of Pope Martin I. So again, you have a lot of variety. You have some emperors that are very much willing to enforce and get on board with papal claims and papal supremacy, and other emperors who deny the Pope the right to deny papal claims, period, that deny who the person the Pope is. They try to assassinate the Pope, kidnap the Pope. Even at some point in time, Emperor Leo III districts the See of Rome to shrink its jurisdiction. I mean, again, it's just all over the place. And then this really gets me then to my third point here. So having done definitions, having gone over the emperors, my third point is that the first millennium can't be a sufficient guide because, as we've already seen with the emperor, that the Orthodox East has been quite inconsistent in its reception of papal supremacy. And when there is inconsistency, we have to look both to whether it's accepting papal claims, and if it does accept them, why is it accepting them? I certainly could not cover 1,000 years of history here. I'm not going to try to do that, but I'm simply going to go through 3 test cases, or 3 case studies, we could say, and sort of illustrate the point, because I think I chose these cases because I think they're relatively well known. And in each of these cases, both the Catholics and the Orthodox walk away saying, yes, this happened as we expected it to happen, and they think history sides with them, which again is exactly my whole point. That's the whole myth of unity. That people, both sides collect the same exact event and think their side is vindicated. And my hope to show is that these events are sufficiently complex that both sides can say that and be perfectly reasonable and rational. But the problem is, still at the end of the day, they're walking away with very different views of what happened. All right, so let me get to my first case study. This would be the case of St. Leo I and Canon 20 of the Council of Chalcedon. So what I'm going to do is read the canon and then talk about what it's saying and then the history that follows from that, both from what I understand to be the Catholic perspective and also the Orthodox perspective. So here's how Canon 28 reads. It says, quote, "The fathers rightly accorded prerogatives to the See of Older Rome," that would be the Rome in Italy, "since that is an imperial city, And moved by the same purpose, the 150 most devout bishops apportioned equal prerogatives to the most holy see of New Rome, that is, Constantinople, reasonably judging that the city, which is honored by the imperial power and senate and enjoying privileges equaling older imperial Rome, should also be elevated to her level in ecclesiastical affairs and take second place after her. The metropolitans of dioceses of Pontus, Asia, and Thrace, but only these, as well as the bishops of these dioceses who work among non-Greeks, are to be ordained by the aforesaid most holy see of the most holy church in Constantinople. End quote. So there's three things I want to point out in Canon 28, because if we don't distinguish these three things, we're not going to see why both Catholics and Orthodox could say that their side basically makes sense of this particular event. So the three things to note are, one, the claim that Constantinople is going to have equal privileges with Rome. That's one claim. Another claim is that Constantinople takes second place after Rome. And the third claim is that the dioceses of Pontus, Asia, and Thrace are now going to be ordained by the Church of Constantinople, which should be the Patriarch of Constantinople. So, of those 3 points, the one that I do not think is seriously in dispute is that Constantinople is second to Rome. Because if you look at the Council of Constantinople 1, Canon 3, again, it's very clear that Constantinople is second to Rome. So I don't really think that was a serious dispute about Canon 20. I do not think that's what the issue was. I think the issue was the other two. Is Constantinople equal in privilege to Rome? And can Constantinople ordain bishops in other dioceses? I think those are the points in dispute. And to further complicate matters, as if they haven't been complex enough, when this canon was being discussed, at least according to St. Leo, the papal legates were ignored. St. Leo complains both to the emperor and to the empress that his legates faithfully represent his position, and they were simply dismissed by the Orthodox bishops. So now we have another added problem, is that the papal legates never approved in the first place of Canon 28. Again, he's going to say exactly why. We'll get to actually some details of what he says. So all this comes to a head because eventually, actually I believe it was the following year, Saint Anatolius, who I should add as a saint in both the Catholic and Orthodox churches, who is a patron of Constantinople, uses the new powers granted to him by Canon 28 to appoint a bishop of Antioch, the Bishop of Antioch. So now things are really going to get out of control because, again, the papal legates never approved of it. This Canon 28 makes outrageous claims. Again, I have to note that from Orthodox perspective, to say that the Bishop of Constantinople can appoint the Bishop of Antioch and can appoint bishops or dioceses obviously goes against at least modern understandings of Orthodox ecclesiology. So there are several levels of problem here. So St. Anatolius, again, Patriarch of Constantinople at the time, uses this authority, appoints the Bishop of Antioch, and St. Leo very rightly is having none of it. So now I'll agree was probably the most famous response of St. Leo. He gives several, but this is to St. Pulcheria, who is empress at the time. So this is perhaps, like I said, the most famous thing that St. Leo says. He says, quote, "But the bishops' assents," this would be the bishops who approved of Canon 28, "which are opposed to the regulations of the holy canons composed at Nicaea in conjunction with your faithful grace, we do not recognize, and by the blessed apostle Peter's authority, we absolutely disannul in comprehensive terms in all ecclesiastical cases, obeying those laws which the Holy Ghost set forth by the 318 bishops, for the pacific observance of all priests in such sort that even if a much greater number were to pass a different decree to theirs, whatever opposed to their constitution would have to be held in no respect." End quote. So very clearly, St. Leo invokes the authority of St. Peter to annul Canon 28. Very clear, right? To again, this is addressed to St. Pulcheria, who was the empress at the time. So the question now is, what was the East's response to the annulment? Did they accept it? And if they accepted it, why did they accept it? So, to answer the first question, there is at least some inconsistency here. So there's no doubt that St. Antonius himself accepts it. Right? The Patriarch of Constantinople accepts it, and it seems like those bishops around him accepted it as well. However, St. Leo himself complains that bishops in Illyria are not obeying his annulment. So there seems to be some parts within the Orthodox community that were just simply ignoring his annulment. And he complains further to Julian, who's another bishop, saying that his annulment isn't being proclaimed in the Eastern Empire. So there seems to be, again, I would even concede that perhaps the majority of the Orthodox are agreeing with Leo's annulment at this time and accepting Leo's annulment, but there does seem to be at least spots where people are not accepting it. But where it really, I think, gets, you could say, interesting, for lack of a better word, is that when we get to the Quinisex Council. So this is now several hundred years later. So again, the canon, this was passed in 451, Chalcedon. Now we're in the Quinisex Council. This is 692. So in the Quinisex Council, its 36th canon renews Canon 28. But I want to pay attention to the language, because remember, I distinguished 3 different parts of Canon 28. So this is now the 36th canon of the Quinisex Council. It says, quote, renewing the enactments by the 150 fathers assembled at the God-protected imperial city and those of the 630 who met at Chalcedon, we decree that the see of Constantinople shall have equal privileges with the see of Old Rome, and shall be highly regarded in ecclesiastical matters as that is, and shall be second after it. So, this is, I think, is very interesting. So, notice that what it is not affirming. So in the Quinisex Council, again, Canon 36, it's affirming that Constantinople shall have equal privileges with Rome and shall be as highly regarded in ecclesiastical matters as it. But it's not saying, like Canon 28 said, that Constantinople was going to be over other dioceses. That claim is not made. So, what to make of this? Well, like I said, I think from a Catholic perspective, you could say, look, St. Antonius clearly agrees with it, and even if we understand, and grant what the Quinisex Council is saying, it seemed to agree with the annulment, at least insofar as Pope Leo, St. Leo, was concerned, which is the appointing of a bishop in Antioch by the Bishop of Constantinople, which the canon doesn't even attempt to renew. There's no mention in Canon 36 in the Quinisex Council that Constantinople can have such privileges over other dioceses. That's not even mentioned there. It's simply reasserting that they shall have equal privilege with Old Rome. So I think you could say, look, the annulment was effective at the end of the day. But again, you can also see from Eastern perspective saying, well, it's complicated because there were patches of dissent at the very least. And then it seems like that the synod held in the Quinisex Council, or sometimes called the Council of Trullo, seemed to be able to renew something that was just, annulled by a pope. So again, this, I think, requires careful consideration. So let's look again at some of St. Leo's reasoning. Now, the reasoning that St. Leo makes to Emperor Marcion, so I quoted where he invokes Peter's authority to St. Pulcheria, but when we look at his reasoning to the Emperor Marcion, he argues, as St. Leo argues to the emperor, that what Canon 28 did was simply unlawful. So this is his argument to Emperor Marcion. He says, as if the unlawful wishes of a multitude could not be rejected, and that state of things which was truly ordained by the Holy Spirit in the Canon of Nicaea could any part be overruled by anyone. Let no synodal councils flatter themselves upon the size of their assemblies, and let not any number of priests, however large, dare either to compare or to prefer themselves to those 318 bishops sitting at the Synod of Nicaea as hallowed by God, with such privilege that, whether by fewer or by more ecclesiastical judgments are supported, whatever is opposed to their authority is utterly destitute of all authority. So in other words, you cannot oppose the Council of Nicaea. This is St. Leo's argument. And later, again, this is also to the same emperor. He says, these holy and venerable fathers, who in the city of Nicaea, after condemning the blasphemous Arius with his impiety, laid down a code of canons for the church to last till the end of the world, survive not only with us, with the whole of mankind in their constitutions. And if anywhere men venture upon was contrary to their decrees, it is ipso facto null and void. So that what is universally laid down for our perpetual advantage can never be modified by any change, nor can the things which were destined for the common good be perverted to private interest. And thus, so long as limits remain, which the fathers fix, no one may invade another's right, but each must exercise himself within the proper and lawful bounds to the extent of his power in the breath of love. End quote. So again, we see the emphasis in from St. Leo to the emperor, where, by the way, he never mentions the authority of Peter to annul to the emperor. He only mentions that to St. Pulcheria, the empress. To the emperor, he says that Canon 28 violates Nicaea. It violates Nicaea because it lays certain privileges that pervert the canons of Nicaea. This is very clear, right? Where the Bishop of Constantinople can appoint bishops of their dioceses. Clearly, that's against the canons of Nicaea, and this is St. Leo's argument. And what I find interesting is, and he makes a very similar argument to the Patriarch of Constantinople himself. So, again, what are we left with? We're left with, why then did the East, to what extent did the East, and why did the East accept Pope Leo's annulment? So, there are several reasons. One, it could just simply be, yes, because they accepted that the Pope just simply has the power to annul canons. Alternatively, it could be because everyone recognized it was improper to ignore the papal legates. Like the Canon 28 never should have existed in the first place. The papal legates said no, and to have a proper ecumenical council, one would think you'd want Rome to be on board with it. You just ignore them and expect nothing to happen is obviously very foolish. Another reason could be the reason that St. Leo himself gives, which is that it violates previous canons. You can't pass this. No matter how large Chalcedon is, obviously as large as it was the Nicaea, that was his point. No matter how big Chalcedon is, you can't overrule Nicaea. So my point is that the East could accept the Pope's correction for a variety of reasons, other than surely because he has the authority of St. Peter and he said so. There's again, a variety of reasons why, and like I said, even to St. Anatolius himself, the Bishop of Constantinople, St. Leo does not make the argument. He makes that to St. Pulcheria. To St. Anatolius, he makes arguments very similar to that of the emperor, that this is just in violation of the canons, and what in the world are you doing over here? So, the question is, was there now clear unity and agreement over the relationship between the Pope of Rome and the Orthodox bishops? And my argument here for the case of St. Leo and Canon 20 is no, there isn't agreement. Like I said, there was agreement to who even accepted St. Leo's annulment. In this case, I would personally argue St. Leo's perfectly in the right. I think to ignore the papal legates, to say that Constantinople's over other dioceses, these are just ridiculous, right? So St. Leo's obviously in the right. But notice, as Orthodox person, I could say Leo's in the right, and yes, get rid of that canon. That canon is completely invalid, without saying anything about the authority of Peter to just annul things, right? So do you see the difference? That people can accept that the Pope can do this, but not for the reasons a Catholic would argue necessarily. So this is part of the difference. And like I said, even in the Quinisex Council, they didn't even dare to try to say Constantinople over other dioceses. So all I have to say is, this is a complex situation with St. Leo and Canon 28. Does he annul it? Yes. Is it largely accepted? Yes, largely accepted, absolutely. But again, like I said, the history gets complicated, and all the various factors that played into Canon 28 don't really help matters. So for the second case study, I want to discuss St. Gregory the Dialogist, or as he's called in the Catholic tradition, St. Gregory the Great. And I'll try to just use St. Gregory the Great to be consistent. But if I slip and say St. Gregory the Dialogist, hopefully you know what I mean. And the title of Ecumenical Patriarch. So, St. John the Faster, he's not a saint in the Catholic Church, I should add. So far, the saints I've been saying have been saints, in fact, in both churches. But St. John the Faster is not a saint in the Catholic Church. But St. John the Faster takes on the title Ecumenical Patriarch. And as I already discussed earlier, when discussing ecumenical councils, ecumenical does not mean universal, as it was translated into Latin, universalis. Right? It's not a universal patriarch or bishop. It is the bishops over the ecumeni, over the imperial world. That's what the title means. So from the Orthodox perspective, this is just kind of a fancy title that has no special significance. But St. Gregory the Great thinks that St. John the Faster is arrogating himself to being the bishop over universalis, over the entire, world, being the one universal bishop. And so St. Gregory notes that not only himself, also his predecessor, Pope Pelagius II, quote, annulling by the authority of the Holy Apostle Peter the acts of said synod, end quote. That would be the synod that gave St. John the Faster his particular title. And again, the title being Ecumenical Patriarch. So we see that, right away, we see that this title actually had already been annulled by St. Gregory's predecessor, Pelagius II. And yet, the St. John the Faster is still apparently going by that title. He's not taking this annulment terribly seriously. And so this is what St. Gregory says to the patriarchs of Alexandria and Antioch. He says, quote, "For as your very holiness knows, this name of universality was offered by the Holy Synod of Chalcedon to the pontiff of the Apostolic See, which by the providence of God I serve. But no one of my predecessors has ever consented to use so profane a title, since, forsooth, if one patriarch is called universal, the name of patriarch in the case of the rest is derogated. But far be it from the mind of a Christian that anyone should wish to seize for himself that whereby he might seem in the least degree to lessen the honor of his brethren." And later on, he writes, "Through the elation of a pompous expression to aim at subjugating to himself all the members of Christ, which cohere to one head only, that is, to Christ." So St. Gregory is saying that this title, which he understands to be a universal bishop, is demeaning to all the other bishops of the world to say he is the one true bishop, that being the bishop of Constantinople. And he mistakenly thinks, he's actually historically incorrect about this, that this title was offered to the See of Rome at the Council of Chalcedon. It's actually not true, and that it was declined. But notice that he doesn't say that, yes, I accept it for myself. He says, no, this is not acceptable. And so, to the emperor, he writes in another epistle, quote, "Lo, he," being St. Peter, "receive the keys of the heavenly kingdom, and power to bind and loose is given him. The care and principality of the whole church is committed to him, and yet he is not called the universal apostle, while the most holy man, my fellow priest John, attempts to be called universal bishop," end quote. So, yeah, and I'll skip the quote from, he also writes to John about this, basically saying, how can your fraternity despise all the other bishops of the world when you press those underneath you? It gives the analogy of the clouds and how the clouds sort of share in the glory, share in the rain, the preaching of good works. So, in this particular case, what is going on here? So first, first notice how the annulments are being ignored. So first, it's very clear that Saint Gregory and his predecessor, Pelagius II, they believe they do in fact have the authority to annul a synod in the Orthodox East. So they think that they have the authority. On the other hand, the Orthodox seem to be simply ignoring that. So this is creating, obviously, a bit of a conflict. And part of the conflict also is a language barrier, because for the Orthodox, the Gregory's arguments, unlike St. Leo's arguments, don't make a lot of sense, because ecumeny isn't like universal. How is this an arrogating himself? He is a bishop of the capital of the Roman Empire. That's what he is. Like, why is this title offensive? It's a mystery to the Orthodox. Whereas to the Catholics, this is nonsense. The bishop of Constantinople can't be the universal bishop to over everything. That doesn't make any sense. Who's over the whole church, as St. Gregory said, would be Peter. He's the one who has the care of the whole church, is committed to him. That's what he said, again, his letter to the emperor, not the bishop of Constantinople. And even he isn't called universal apostle, universal bishop. So what ends up happening historically is that the Orthodox simply, when they communicate with the Catholic Church, they just don't use the title ecumenical patriarch. They simply opt out of using it just to keep the peace. And this includes a more controversial figure such as St. Photius, who obviously we'll get to the last case study, the Photian Schism. So even St. Photius says, and I should add, of course, that St. Photius is not in any way a saint in the Catholic Church. But even he doesn't use the title ecumenical patriarch before the Pope. So, but at the same time, we can see that despite the various popes' annulments, the title is still used today, right? The current patriarch, Bartholomew, is still called the ecumenical patriarch. So what can we see from this? So we can see that the Pope believes he has the power to annul, and from his perspective, that annulment is in fact respected. Again, why? Because the Orthodox bishops stop using the title in front of him. So as far as he could tell, his annulment works. But of course, from the Orthodox perspective, it was more a matter of diplomacy, because why get into a fight about this? If the Pope doesn't like this title, let's just not use it in front of him. There's no need to cause a big hubbub over this. So again, you can see how both sides walk away thinking that they have been vindicated. That yes, St. Gregory is going to say, yes, I successfully annulled that synod in the East. I have this jurisdiction. And the East is going to say, well, we kind of can pick and choose which papal annulments we want to recognize. And so it is inconsistent, right? We have these various conflicts, and it's inconsistent reception in the East. I'll just simply add before I move on that I have seen some Orthodox use some of these letters to argue that St. Gregory the Great denied universal jurisdiction. Again, first, he's annulling a synod in the East, right? So that I think is shaky. But even for the sake of argument, since I'm not a biographer of St. Gregory, so let's say for the sake of argument that for some reason he does have a lower view of papal supremacy than, say, St. Leo. I personally don't think that, but for the sake of argument, let's grant that. That actually does very, very little damage, because I would argue from a Catholic perspective that overall the popes have been very consistent on papal claims. So you even have one pope here or there who's not as consistent as the rest. That really doesn't matter at the end of the day, right? It's not like St. Gregory is continuing this long line of tradition, or the Pope saying, Peter is not the universal apostle. He's not doing that at all. Again, you go back to previous popes like St. Leo, makes very strong papal claims. So again, I've seen some Orthodox argue this. I just don't think it's a very strong argument. And again, doesn't make any sense of the very fact that St. Gregory clearly thinks he could annul synods outside his, what he's called maybe local jurisdiction. Okay, so then for my third and final case study in the first millennium of how, again, the argument being that there was no clearly established relationship between the Pope and Orthodox bishops in the first millennium, and so we cannot use the first millennium as a sufficient guide. We definitely should consult history, no doubt about that, but it can't be a sufficient guide, because when we look at the history, it's not going to be clear. It's not going to be a super clear, helpful guide. So the Photian Schism. So long story short, probably largely due to the very sad, embarrassing fight between Rome and Constantinople over the who's going to accept the Bulgars into the church. Saint Photius tries to have Pope Nicholas I deposed and anathematized. He even gets the Holy Roman Emperor Louis II, whose younger brother the Pope denied a divorce, to cooperate, and everything is set together. And in exchange, actually, the Eastern Emperor, especially Michael II, he would even call the Holy Roman Emperor by the title Emperor, which is a very big deal. Very rarely did the Eastern Roman Empire actually call the Holy Roman Emperor Emperor. They usually called them King, and that made them very mad. They felt like they were up to the same level as the Eastern Emperor. Anyway, so everything is organized on the political side by Photius. So the Holy Roman Emperor, he would help depose Pope Nicholas. In exchange, the Eastern Emperor would then recognize the Holy Roman Emperor as and by the title Emperor. But all this is irrelevant, because Pope Nicholas dies before anything can happen. And then more to the point, then one of the co-emperors, Michael III, is assassinated, and now Basil I becomes sole emperor. So Basil I wants good relationships with Rome because he wants to reconquer Italy. You definitely cannot reconquer Italy successfully without the Pope's support. You simply need to have the Pope if you're going to take it back and make it once again part of the Roman Empire. It always was how things were seen to be as they were supposed to be. That how do you have their empire without Rome? Right? This also was supposed to be as a part of the nation. Anyway, so to help appease the Pope, Basil orchestrates it so that Photius is deposed. So sort of to keep the date straight, in 867, that's when Photius had arranged to depose of Pope Nicholas. Then 2 years later, in 869, Photius himself is deposed successfully by a council, and this council makes very strong papal claims. Now, long story short, Basil just gives up on trying to maintain good relationship with Rome. He just simply does because he really wants the Bulgarians to be under the Orthodox Church, which obviously they are to this very day. So he gives up with that, and basically then when St. Ignatius dies, who's a very pro-papal supremacy patriarch of Constantinople, when St. Ignatius dies, then St. Photius once again becomes patriarch. And this then leads to the Council of 879. So from an Orthodox perspective, just as the Council of 869 overturned the understanding of 867, where you could even depose a pope, 879 overturns everything in 869. Now, the emperor, again, I mentioned the emperor's key of unity. The emperor basically forces John VIII to send legates and basically makes it happen. And to be fair, John VIII also kind of wanted to send them because he's hoping for imperial aid against the Saracens. So again, once again, it's very rarely, if ever, I should say, are councils held for purely theological matters. We'd like to think every council's held because of theological purity and for no other reasons, but the reality is often politics plays a significant role. And again, this is definitely the case. The emperor can exercise a heavy hand, and Pope John VIII feels somewhat compelled to listen because he really wants to be protected from the Saracens. So, excuse me. When the emperor receives letters, St. Photius does alter the letters of John, especially John's claims to universal jurisdiction, which obviously is just inherently create miscommunication that the Pope's claims is not fully understood or realized in the Orthodox East. So at the end of the day, here's what the council proclaims. It says, quote, "If anyone, however, dares to rewrite and call this rule of faith some other exposition besides that of the sacred symbol," that is the Nicene Cosmopolitan Creed, "which has been spread abroad from above by our blessed and holy fathers, even as far as ourselves, and to snatch the authority of the confession of those divine men, and impose his own invented phrases, and put this forth as a common lesson to the faithful, or to those who return from some kind of heresy, and display the audacity to falsify completely the antiquity of the sacred and venerable rule with illegitimate words or additions or subtractions, such a person should, according to the vote of the holy ecumenical synods, which has already been acclaimed before us, be subjected to complete the frocking if he happens to be one of the clergymen." And the sentence continues, but you basically get the idea here, is that the rule of faith, the creed, is not to be altered by invented phrases. It's not to have any illegitimate words or additions or subtractions. And as the Orthodox East understands that means no to the filioque, which is obviously a big part of the dispute between Photius and Nicholas, and at this point really between the Catholics and the Orthodox during this period of time. So the Orthodox think that, well, this means a big unambiguous no to the filioque, don't add that to the creed. But obviously, from the Catholic perspective, it's just, well, no, it's not that. It's you can't, introduce heretical things to the creed, right? It's not saying absolutely no additions. It's not like no invented phrases. Now, what does really mean no invented phrases? Just making things up, random things? Well, the filioque certainly isn't that. It's not just some made-up invented phrase, right? This goes back to Saint Cyril of Alexandria and Saint Augustine. So, again, the wording is such that both sides can take away from it as if they're coming out victorious. And I think what will really emphasize this point is Canon 1 of this council, which I will read. And it says, quote, "This holy and ecumenical council has decreed that so far as concerns any clerics or laymen or bishops from Italy that are staying in Asia, Europe, Africa under bond or deposition or anathema imposed by the most holy Pope John, all such persons are to be held in the same condition of penalization also by the most holy patriarch of Constantinople, Photius. That is to say, either deposed or anathematized or excommunicated. All those persons, on the other hand, whom Photius, our most holy patriarch, has condemned or may condemn to excommunication or deposition or anathematization in any diocese whatsoever, whether clerics or laymen or any of the persons who are of the prelatical or priestly rank, are to be treated likewise by the most holy Pope John and his holy Church of God of the Romans, and be held in the same category of penalization. Nothing, however, shall affect the priorities due to the most holy throne of the Church of the Romans, nor shall anything redound to the detriment of her president as touching the sum total of innovations either now or at any time hereafter, end quote. So there's a lot going on there. But the key points are that whomever Pope John has excommunicated or penalized, whatever, that's going to be recognized by the Patriarch Photius. And likewise for Photius, whom he has excommunicated, anathematized, whatever it may be, Pope John's recognized. Now the question is, does this put Rome and Constantinople on equal rank? Well, the wonderful clause at the end seems to suggest no, but in a very ambiguous way. It says again, nothing shall, however, affect the priorities due to the most holy throne of the Church of the Romans. So clearly there's still some kind of priority given to the Church of Rome, but it's not really clearly defined. So again, the Orthodox would walk away from this saying, look, we just showed how the Pope is not above any other bishop, because there has to be mutual recognition between the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope of Rome. But on the other hand, Caius is rightly point out that in that very last sentence, it still emphasizes the priority of the Church of Rome. So again, just like with the statement in 879, this Canon 1 is an act of diplomacy. What can we conclude from this? Is there a clear understanding between the role of the Pope and the role of even the Patriarch of Constantinople here? I would argue no. That what's going on here is, once again, skillful diplomacy. You had a clash, you had skillful diplomacy, and you had an emperor who I already explained exercised quite a heavy hand against John VIII, but like I said, he wasn't too upset about this because he wants to get the emperor on his side. So both sides, again, can claim victory. So for the Catholic side, the Council of 869 is now considered the Eighth Ecumenical Council that explicitly confirms and affirms the Pope's jurisdiction over Constantinople, but Photius is deposed because of Pope Nicholas, as well as protecting the Pope from being deposed. So that's what 869 does. While the East, however, in the Eastern Orthodox mind, 869 might not have happened because it was overruled by 879, so that's sort of out of the view here. And the idea is that the Pope has to recognize Constantinople more or less as an equal, and there shouldn't be any changes to the creed. Again, that's how the Orthodox interpret things I read, and I already explained how the Catholics need not interpret it that particular way. So, again, did the East accept papal claims, accept papal supremacy? Well, as I already conceded, certainly St. Ignatius, the previous Patriarch of Constantinople, did, but with St. Photius, it's much more difficult to say. Instead, St. Photius seems to be content with skillful diplomacy, compromise, vaguely worded resolutions that allow for peace. That seems to be the priority. But again, the problem is if the priority is always going to be, let's make peace to keep the unity, we don't actually have a clearly defined relationship between the Pope of Rome and the Orthodox bishops. It's still not there because it's constantly being avoided. Whenever there's serious collision, it's avoided. What to do? On both sides. On both sides. Everyone's content to prioritize peace. So, I want to address, I think would be an obvious objection. So far I've argued using 3 case studies in the instance of the emperor that the first millennium is a necessary, to be sure, but not sufficient condition for restoring relations with the Pope of Rome and the Orthodox bishops. So I think the objection was simply ask, well, okay, grant all this, you said nothing about the first 3 centuries. Why not go to the first 3 centuries, right? You have no emperor, obviously. You don't have any of these complications. Every complication that I mentioned doesn't go back to the first 3 centuries. So I think there are responses from both sides. From the Catholic side, I think the Catholics would want to say that there is more development in the proper sense, not innovation, a proper development and unpacking of the understanding of papal supremacy. At least starting from St. Leo the First and certainly going to Vatican I. I don't think it would be sufficient to say, well, we're going to cut it off arbitrarily at like 312 or something before the Edict of Milan, or 324 right before Nicaea. Well, let's cut it off arbitrarily and then say that's just the state of the matter. Because there is a lot more understanding, a lot more depth, nuance in the Catholic tradition that comes past it, obviously. I mean, it's over a millennium. And similarly, from the Orthodox side, it's just as easy as pretending none of the canons exist, because the canons are very important for regulating and disciplining bishops. So there's lots of canons I could choose for this to illustrate this, but I'll also choose one, and this would be Canon 6 from Constantinople I. Excuse me. So here's how it reads. It says, but if any, being neither heretics nor excommunicate nor condemned, in other words, there's no outstanding or unusual issue here, nor under previous accusation for alleged faults, should declare that they have any ecclesiastical charge against the bishop. In other words, as long as a person isn't a heretic or excommunicated or any of these, edge cases, as long as that's not the case, it's like a regular person, and they're bringing a charge, an ecclesiastical charge against the bishop. Okay, now what do we do? It says, the Holy Synod bids them first lay their charges before all the bishops of the province, and before them prove the accusations, whatsoever they may be, which they have brought against the bishop. And if the convictionals should be unable rightly to settle the charges brought against the bishop, then the parties must betake themselves to a greater synod of bishops of that diocese called together for this purpose. And as a skip a line, it says, and if anyone, despising what has been decreed concerning these things, shall presume to annoy the ears of the emperor, or the courts of temporal judges, or to dishonor of all the bishops of his province, shall trouble an ecumenical synod, such a one shall by no means be admitted as an accuser. For as much as he has cast contempt upon the canons, be brought a reproach upon the order of the church. End quote. In other words, for the Orthodox, if you have a charge you want to make against the bishop, again, assuming you're a heretic or something, it goes to a synod. And then if you still have a further court of appeals, it has to be brought to a larger synod. And that's pretty much the end of it. Don't annoy the emperor. As I've said, the emperor has lots of power and can maintain unity. Don't go to secular or temporal judges, right? Don't try to get judges involved. And don't trouble the ecumenical council, right? That's basically what it says. So if you have a problem with the bishop, go to a synod of bishops. If you're still not happy, go to a larger synod, and it kind of stops there. So for the Orthodox, this is still exactly how we practice our ecclesiology. And I'll just simply note, on the Orthodox side, notice how there's neither an ultimate appeal to the Pope in Canon 6, nor is the Pope seen to be exempt in Canon 6. Now, this is not to say that Catholics don't have good responses, and I'm not trying to say that. I'm simply trying to say the importance of Canon 6 in Orthodox ecclesiology. And from our understanding, our interpretation of Canon 6, that the Pope isn't necessarily immune to this. And again, like I said, it's not that the Catholics don't answer to this. It's just that this is how the Orthodox understand the particular canon. So all to say is, no, the first few centuries are going to be good enough, both on the Catholic side because of further proper development of the doctrine of the papacy, and on the Orthodox side because, again, we have canons that are very important to our ecclesiology that we just can't pretend don't exist. Okay. So then, fourth and finally, what is the way forward? Right? What is the way forward? We cannot, and should not dismiss history. Again, hopefully I've made that clear. But we also can't pretend that we can go back to some pristine point of agreement if that point doesn't actually exist. So if we have the emperor, and there never was any kind of bottom-up cell view of the papacy, the task now falls to us to be one, as the Father and Son are one, following our traditions while recognizing we are in a new situation. And quite frankly, as I think it's very appropriate, the Pope of Rome leads the way. So I'm going to quote from John Paul II's Ut Unum Sint. He says, Quote, when the Catholic Church affirmed that the office of the Bishop of Rome corresponds to the will of Christ, she does not separate this office from the mission entrusted to the whole body of bishops, who are also vicars and ambassadors of Christ. The Bishop of Rome is a member of the college, and the bishops are his brothers in the ministry. Whatever relates to the unity of all Christian communities clearly forms part of the concerns of the primacy. As Bishop of Rome, I am fully aware, as I have reaffirmed in the present encyclical letter, that Christ ardently desires the full and visible communion of all those communities in which, by virtue of God's faithfulness, his Spirit dwells. I am convinced that I have a particular responsibility in this regard, above all, and acknowledging the ecumenical aspirations of the majority of the Christian communities, and in heeding the request made of me to find a way of exercising the primacy which, while in no way renouncing what is essential to his mission, is nevertheless open to a new situation. End the quote there. So I think John Paul II very wisely says, look, I acknowledge that the other bishops are proper bishops, that the Bishop of Rome is a member of the College of Bishops, but at the same time, not in any way deny the prerogatives of the Bishop of Rome. We have to recognize that we may be in a new situation. And this is exactly what I would suggest we are, because there is no emperor, and we're in a point of schism. We've been in schism for almost 1,000 years. I think it's tragic that we're going to have a 1,000-year anniversary of schism. Though again, like I said, as I recognize, I understand that the schism didn't really get serious until the 18th century. Nevertheless, the Great Schism of 1054 is still an important event. So the Pope is sort of the leader of the church, and it says pointing the way to a new situation. So I think the future lies open for us of how we want to bring together, as is necessary, as the Pope rightly quoted, Christ's high priestly prayer in John, to be one, as I and the Father are one. Right? This is what's absolutely necessary for us to do as Christians. And so to conclude, my answer to the question, what still divides us, is the point that was always divided us: the role of the Pope of Rome in relation to the Orthodox churches. The solution to healing this division is not as easy as looking back to the first millennium. For while it's necessary to consult its history, the first millennium does not provide a sufficient answer to these questions. Emperors were essential to Christian unity, Exhibit A being the ecumenical councils, but they're no longer emperors. Further, the Orthodox East has been inconsistent in its stance and reception of papal supremacy, regards to both whether it accepts it and also why it accepts it. And we've seen this in the cases of St. Leo in Canon 20 of Chalcedon, St. Gregory in a title Ecumenical Patriarch, and the Photian Councils. Each of these case studies has had complicating factors concerning the Orthodox reception of the various papal claims. And at the same time, both sides could look at at the events in their favor. And in every instance, both Catholics and Orthodox would say, yes, the history vindicates my side. And this is a problem, because both sides are right. Both sides have excellent points they can make of how the history favors them. But then again, this is the argument of the myth of unity. If it's the case that both sides can just look at history and walk away saying, yes, history vindicates my side, and both can have strong evidence in their favor, then how much unity is there in the first place? Our task following Pope John Paul II is to look at this, as he calls it, a new situation, which we could say maybe has been partially explored in the first 3 centuries of the church, but not clearly enough to unambiguously discern the relationship between the Pope and the Orthodox bishops. Our task is undoubtedly a formidable one, especially since we are prone, as in the American Civil War is nicknamed, to a war of brother against brother. But I sincerely hope that we, Catholic and Orthodox, hold to the unity of the faith and live our confession of one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And rather than make war with our brother, we remember the words of St. Anthony the Great: if we gain our brother, we have gained God. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. DiDonato. Excellent presentation. Wow, a lot of food for thought. There's a lot of stuff to interact with there, which I'm sure we'll be doing in the months to come. So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, and also not only charitable, but very articulate and well thought out. So I really, really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure. Did you have any comments or corrections, even? As I know, I hit upon some touchy issues, with Saint Leo and Saint Gregory. I know those are often
Ooh, yeah,
touchy.
I definitely have some comments and questions. I'll make them quick if that's okay with you then.
Yeah, that's
So
fine.
for one, Saint Photius, actually in the Byzantine Catholic Church, we accept Photius as a saint. He's
Oh, I
commemorated.
didn't know that.
Yeah,
Okay.
so
Okay.
in quite a few of the Eastern Catholic churches, he's commemorated. Of course,
I
he's
did not know
not
that.
in the Latin rite, but see, the thing is, um, there's somewhat of an implicit canonization if they're recognized in the Eastern Catholic calendars, right? So
Yeah.
though a Latin Rite Catholic may not particularly venerate Photius, I think they have to accept that he's a saint because Rome has given its approbation to the liturgical calendar where he's venerated. So Photius and Palamas, for example, are on the calendar.
I did not know that. Okay. Well, that's very helpful.
Yeah, yeah. So with the issue of Gregory, my impression was that when it comes to him criticizing this idea of universal bishop, I agree with you that he did maintain a view of papal supremacy. I agree with you on that. But I thought when he was critiquing the title of ecumenical patriarch, what he was critiquing is this idea that the patriarch of Rome is basically the exclusive bishop of the world, insofar as the other bishops aren't actually bishops, which would be absurd. I mean, neither Catholic
Yeah.
or Orthodox accept that.
Yeah.
Now, that's probably not what Constantinople meant, but I
Right.
think
No,
that
not at
that's what,
all.
yeah,
Yeah.
but I think that that's what Gregory thought he meant, and that's what he was trying to refute. I may be misunderstanding Gregory,
Yeah.
but I kind of think that's what he was criticizing. Um, so what do you think about that? What is
Oh,
that your
yeah.
impression as well?
Sorry, I must have miscommunicated that. No, that's how I read Gregory too. Is
Okay.
maybe this is the difference. Maybe there is some disagreement. I read him saying is that if there is a universal bishop, then what is the point of having these other bishops? You just have this one bishop over the whole world,
Okay.
and then it basically demotes all the other bishops. That's
Right.
how
Okay.
maybe I apologize, and then I didn't
You
articulate that
may
very
you may have
clearly.
said it, and I may have missed
So
it.
I probably did not do a very good job, and I apologize for
No,
that.
no, you're
I
fine.
didn't mean to say that.
I just wanted to make sure I was on the right page. Okay. With the Chalcedon in Canon 28, you did mention there that Leo annuls it by the authority of Saint Peter. But
Yes.
then you mentioned the rationale behind it was it's contrary to Nicaea. Well, both Orthodox and Catholics ended up conceding Canon 28 further down the road. I think a few centuries later for the Orthodox, and by the 9th century for Catholics. So both ended up agreeing that, okay, well, this can effectively overturn Nicaea or give a different
Yeah.
interpretation of Nicaea. Yet the claim to it being annulled by the authority of St. Peter, he claims to himself, and of course the Bishop of Constantinople and the Emperor concede. Does that factor in to this discussion of whether or not the East conceded, at least on this point, a universal jurisdiction?
Well, like I said, I think some did. I think St. Antonius did concede that. I think he
Yeah.
did. To the emperor, I would need to track down a letter where he invokes it, because in letters that I read, he doesn't actually mention St. Peter's authority. He mentions it, like I said, to St. Pulcheria. I could have just simply missed it when I was trying to go through the letters on this topic. That's
From
very
what,
possible.
from what I recall, the emperor conceded the issue with canon.
But in
Yeah.
the reasoning that St. Leo gives to the emperor, it has to do with violating the canons of Nicaea. At least in the letter that I read, but it's very possible I simply missed one. I was looking for when does he invoke St. Peter's authority and to whom? So that's and I didn't see it in the emperor. But like I said, from an Orthodox perspective, the question is why is this acknowledged? Is it because the papal legates were ignored?
Right.
And this is simply improper. You just simply can't ignore legates from anyone. Right? You can't ignore the Bishop of Alexandria's legates and push something through and expect it to be hunky-dory. This is not realistic. Right?
But for Anatolius, you do concede that for him, it wasn't just because it violated Nicaea. Okay, I got you.
No,
just making sure that I'm understanding.
And I even said, I think I would even concede for the majority of bishops. I think we could even say that in the orthodoxies. But I also said there were exceptions, right? In
Sure.
Illyria, and there are these passages where it didn't seem to be the case, and things that are really complicated when you get to the Quintessence Council, Canon 36, like I said, because we really had to parse out what's going on in 20. That's what I tried to do. I said there's really three things going on in 28. The priority of Roman Constantinople, Constantinople's number two, the equal privileges clause, and then the part where Constantinople has authority over other bishops. And I tried to explain, it's very complicated because Canon 36 reaffirms equal privileges, but then not the authority over other bishops. And like I said, I don't really think Constantinople being second is even in dispute because of the First Council of Constantinople. So then the question is, what's going on? When St. Leo annuls this, right, annuls Canon 28, and then the Quintessence Council reaffirms it, in their translations, renews it, what's going on? So if the East understood that St. Leo's problem was Constantinople's authority over Antioch, then we could say they fully accepted the annulment because they didn't understand the annulment to apply to the other part of the equal privileges. But if they understood that, no, St. Leo's annulling the whole thing's being annulled, then there seems to be a problem where now this council, which Rome, if I recall correctly, wasn't even invited to, right, is now reaffirming something the Pope had annulled. And like I said, you could argue either way. This is why both Orthodox and Catholics walk away from this event and say, yep, that's what we thought would happen. Right? This is my argument. This is the problem, is that for all these events, we both can look at the same exact thing and say, yep, that's what I thought would happen. But we're saying opposite things. We have opposite conclusions. Because the history is so complex, because these events are complex. Because, like I said, we like to imagine these councils happening in some kind of pure, pristine state, but that is just not what happened.
Certainly. Yeah, I don't know if we've ever had that state.
Yeah.
So just a couple quick questions, if you have a few more moments. So,
yeah.
869 being overturned, I totally agree that 879 at that time overturns some of the discipline. I would actually say the vast majority of 869 is disciplinary, but the issues related to Photius, I would concede, are overturned in 879. But I wouldn't necessarily say that everything was necessarily overturned unless there's good evidence for that. I think your perspective is that the entire thing is overturned by 879. Is there any kind of evidence that you could point to that the entire thing and not just partially 869 was overturned?
I think that's a great question. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So this is, again, where I think both sides can affirm their sides. You're absolutely right. You could say, look, show me in 879 where explicitly annuls or refutes some of the things asserted in 869. Now, so you're right. It's not there. But I would say from an Orthodox perspective, the context, the understanding of 879 was to be 869 redone. That was how the council was understood, and is still understood by the Orthodox. It wasn't, in the Orthodox mind, it wasn't that this is like modifying or changing 869. This is, we're doing this over again. Scrap that, we're doing this from scratch. That was the mentality. So if that mentality is the case, we could say, look, 879 simply overturns 869 by its very nature because that's why it was called. That's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to do this again, just like has happened many times with other kinds of councils that are overturned. Even not every single canon of a previous council is overturned. Once it's declared invalid council, it's just tossed. You don't have to say, well, we didn't literally go through the previous council and nullify every single dot and tittle. For the Orthodoxies, that's unnecessary. We're saying this council is now, we're tackling the same issue, but we're now going to do it right. In that case, the third time, we're going to do this right. Still, nevertheless, do you see what I'm saying? So I completely agree with what you're saying. I completely understand from a Catholic perspective. I could say, look, 879 doesn't overwrite everything in 869. And so I'm going to put the two together and have something perfectly coherent. But I hope it also, you can see from an Orthodox perspective, you say, no, the very nature of 879 is to replace 869 from the get-go. That's its whole purpose. And so we don't need to have every single thing nullified. Yeah,
that definitely makes sense. Okay. I think you had mentioned Canon 6 of 381. I'd have to go back and look and see, because I know that the West did not necessarily accept all of the canons of 381. And so
I should have mentioned that. Oh, you're right. I should absolutely mention that. But I believe Canon 6 is one of those ones added later.
Yeah,
Oh,
but
I
let's
should have
that's
mentioned that.
fine.
You are correct.
But
Yeah.
even if it's not accepted by Rome, that's fine. Let's just
Yeah.
because I have a question just simply about it from the East's perspective.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because I think you were mentioning, if I understood properly, you were saying that Canon 6 talks about here's what you do if there's a difficulty, and it doesn't mention an appeal to the Pope. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right. So what I've noticed, however, is after 381, at the time of, for example, 449, you have appeals being lodged to Rome to overturn an emperor's council.
Yeah.
And they cite Sardica as the reason, which of course Sardica is interesting because it's a Western council, but here the
Yes,
East
yes,
is citing a Western council to say
yes,
that they have the right to appeal to Rome. So you do have instances where they do appeal to Rome, and so
yes.
they would see perhaps, I guess, an expanded right to appeal that maybe Canon 6 doesn't account for. What do you think about that?
No, so yes, so let me be clear. So as I understand, and again, I realize in the Orthodox tradition, canon law is a very complicated topic that really requires an expert in it.
Mhm.
So my amateur understanding of Canon 6 is this is sort of how things would function normally. This is the normal procedure. But that doesn't, but of course, the Pope is recognized as the leader of the church. And so if you have an extraordinary situation, go to the Pope's leadership. Let the Pope take the lead. But that's not a part of like the process. You see what I'm saying? There's a difference between here's sort of the normal process of things, here's sort of the regular wheels and gears that make the machine of ecclesiastical order turn, and then here's okay, we're really at an impasse. Ephesus 2 was a giant mess. Everyone's embarrassed by this. Please, Pope, lead the way. We're lost. Lead
Mhm.
us. And the Pope does. That's a blessing.
Mhm.
So, but that's not an ordinary part of ecclesiastical correction or discipline. That was a necessary circumstance, and the Pope did his due diligence and exercised fantastic saintly leadership in those trying times.
I see. Okay. And then one other question you had mentioned there about, how do we proceed since we can't have an ecumenical council because we don't have an emperor anymore. Okay. So I guess then my question is, all right, well, are universal councils, this avoids the term, ecumenical,
Yeah.
because it's going to bring the connotation of an emperor. So let's put that to the side and just speak of a universal or general council. Would you say that the ability of the church to definitively settle matters of faith and morals in a universal council is part of the essay of the church? Or is it just part of the bene essay, the well-being, but it's not necessarily a divine institution? Is that organ a divine institution, or is it just something that's added later on?
The organ being, I'm sorry, say it again,
The
to
organ of a
determine matters
yeah,
definitively. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, the organ of a universal council being able to settle matters of faith and morals, or govern it even in matters of
Yeah.
discipline. Do you think that that organ is a divine institution, or is it just something that was added later on just because this was good for the church?
Well, like I said, it's difficult for me because I would argue there isn't a universal council ever in that sense. The ecumenical councils are the councils of the empire. So I'm not even sure what this would mean that we're going to have a universal council in the sense that's even broader than that of one particular country, albeit at that point in time, the only really first world country we could say in modern terms of Europe. So I'm not exactly sure what you mean because I'm not sure that's really ever happened where you have
Yeah.
a universal council in such a broad sense where literally the whole world agrees, because clearly you have bishops in Persia, India, Ethiopia, right? So clearly I don't think that's ever really happened. Perhaps I know in Nicaea 1 they had some bishops from Persia, so perhaps Nicaea 1 is the closest we've ever had to that, but that
Mhm.
definitely is the exception.
I
And
see.
even
I
then,
see what
I'm
you
not
mean.
sure if
Yeah.
literally every church in the whole world is actually there. So I would say I'm not even sure if this has ever happened to have a council in universal sense.
If that's what we mean by universal, yeah. But I would say that from a Catholic perspective, what we would mean by universal council is not necessarily that you have representation of everyone, because 381 doesn't represent everyone. It doesn't
Of
represent,
course,
yes.
yes, yes,
But a Catholic would still hold to it as a universal council. And the reason why is it's ratified by the Pope as universally binding.
yes,
So at
yes.
least from a Catholic perspective, we would say that there are universal councils, not necessarily in the sense that every bishop is represented, but the entire episcopate can be said to be represented in insofar as the Pope has confirmed that this is universally binding for all.
Right.
Now, I know that's going to be probably a different theory of universal councils for you.
Certainly.
So, but
Yes.
that might answer my question. That probably answers my question then. So you would say that there really isn't this a universal body of, well, you would say that there isn't an organ of bishops that could be exercised in a universal council that is part of a divine institution, because there has never been such a thing. It's probably impossible to gather such a thing. So you would say it's not part of the essay of the church.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
and that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah. So I mean, if you would say that, then sure, you would be right. There would be no way to move forward with an ecumenical council, because we don't have an emperor. But at least from the Catholic perspective, we would say that, well, there is a way to understand a universal council, and we would still say that perhaps we could move forward with the participation of the East if they were going to be on board and recognize this as universal. But if they don't recognize it as universal, it's going to just be Florence redone again.
Right, exactly. And I guess that's maybe what I could say is that if there is going to be anything approximating an ecumenical council, it's going to have to be purely bottom up. And like I already argued, if we're not for the emperor, probably almost all the councils that we regard as ecumenical would have not happened or fallen flat or just been chaos. So perhaps we could say in the abstract, it's possible for this to happen, but it has to be all bottom up. And so I just think it's very impractical. We've seen it recently. In the past decade, we've seen Orthodox bishops try to do this, and it's, as I would have predicted, not going to be very successful. It's kind of embarrassing on top of it. But I let me say, I definitely appreciate the Catholic perspective, because you have a way of having universal definitive teaching that's not beholden to all of this madness.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I definitely appreciate that, and I definitely respect that.
That's very helpful, very very insightful. And I think that there's a lot of truth to what you're saying about bottom up, because there was somebody who was saying that, well, in the same way that really the schism ultimately happened on an unofficial level, kind of bottom up, and then was only later on institutionally declared. Perhaps reunion is going to have to be bottom up, unofficial, and only later declared. Maybe.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the way forward. And in David Earnhardt's article, The Myth of Schism, he mentions that historically, even today, you have that, where in countries of persecution, Catholic and Orthodox still work together, and there effectively is no schism. Right. And that's
persecution. Maybe persecution will end up bringing us together. I mean, it would be a very sad reason to bring us together, but it could be that that's what ends up doing it. I mean, things get so bad for Christians.
Exactly. To be perfectly honest, Christ doesn't promise us a life of ease and comfort. What he wants for us is unity. So you know what? If it takes persecution and discomfort to bring us together, that very well could be the providence of God. It will be uncomfortable, but he wants us to be one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. He doesn't want us to live a life of luxury, right? So between those two options, I don't really think there's any competition. Have one church or not live at ease.
Well, Dr. DiDonato, thank you so much. I think you presented an excellent case, very different than what you tend to hear, which I think was very helpful. In fact, it accounted for a lot of the evidence out there from an Orthodox perspective. So very, very impressive. And also it's interesting to hear, okay, well, what's the solution then from this perspective? And I think there's a whole lot of truth to what you're saying. And so, wow, thank you so much. This was a really good presentation. I'm really looking forward in the coming months to thinking further about it and exploring it more. So once again, thank you so much.
You are very welcome. Always feel welcome to contact me.
Absolutely. God bless.